Okay, good evening, everybody. Apologies for the slight delay. We had a few technical hitches because this slot has been oversubscribed in many ways, I'm glad to say. But hopefully you will not be disappointed, those of you who have tried their hardest to get a slot on this session and have managed. We have two fantastic speakers, authors this evening. First, we have Christina Longdon. She'll be presenting first. Just a very brief biodata of Chris. Chris has a background in social housing and has worked for various housing associations, local authorities, councils, etc., across the Northwest. From there, she went into an advisory role and worked in terms of housing policy with government departments and ministers, etc. Thereafter, she spent some time in Africa and did some kind of anthropological field work with Bushmen, I think in Namibia, if I'm correct. Correct me, Christine, if I'm not. And published some of their narratives and some of their stories. Then she came back to the UK and worked very successfully with a company that deals with what do they? How best can I frame it? With fair trade, actually, a lot to do with the importation of fair trade coffee, which is very successful and is continuing. And then, because of her personal links through her great, could be another great there, but I think it's great-great-grandfather, who was indeed, unbeknown to the family until her father did some genealogical work, was a convert to Islam and part of the Victorian Muslim community. And Christina's produced this wonderful publication, written in a very user-friendly kind of social history style. Christina has a history, has a history in history. And she will, I'm sure, be referring to this wonderful book throughout her presentation. And I think without further ado, Chris, I'll hand over to you if you're ready.
I am. Thank you very much.
Oh, we have Yahya's slide. Oh, right. Okay. Over to you, Chris.
Hi, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Hope everybody's okay. It's really strange because I can't hear people talking back, but I'll just do what I've got to do, which is it's a brief presentation. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the life of Robert Reschid Stanley. So I will try and not talk too fast, but give you the headlines really of the research that I've dedicated my life to for the last 2 years. It's got a little bit obsessive, but it's an amazing man whose story was hidden for so long. So I'll try and share my screen with you. Here we go. Hopefully people can see this now. And if I click through, that's the only photograph that we have of my great-great-great-grandfather as mayor. We have a couple more photographs, which I can chat about later. But yeah, he was born in 1828, and that was 10 years before Victoria even came to the throne, and he died in 1911. And a lot of the story begins with my dad being made redundant. My dad was a lorry mechanic, and he was made redundant, and he decided he would grasp the opportunity with both hands and research into his family history. Now, when you're doing your family history, I'm sure most of you know, you tend to cling first of all to people who you know a little bit about. So he knew that his great-great-grandfather had been a mayor of Stalybridge over on the east side of Manchester. But this is the thing that he didn't know. He was given by a relative a small magazine called The Crescent, and it was the edition from April 1907. And in that magazine was an interview with a man called Quillian, who we will talk about later. And there is a photograph. This is the magazine itself, and the photograph is of Robert Stanley wearing a fez, which really threw all of us. Why is great-great-great-grandfather wearing a fez? That is the actual fez. Even stranger was the fact that even though we knew nothing about this man other than he had been a mayor, somebody had kept his fez and presented it to my dad and said, I don't know why I've got this fez, but somebody's kept it. It was clearly the fez in the photograph from 100 years ago. The next strange thing was my granny had this in her possession, which she knew belonged to him. And this is a typing with the Star and Crescent of Islam. Now, we think that this came from his association with the Liverpool Mosque, which I'll talk about again in a little while. This is where I first found even more information about him. And I should mention now, before I carry on, that Dr. Seddon was really instrumental in nudging our family to doing more work on this, because he was interested from his own research in this story, and he kept saying, this is such an incredible story, somebody in your family has to go and tell this story and do some more work on it. So Muggins here ended up down the archives and devoting a lot of time to things like town council minutes, where I could actually see for the first time his handwriting, and that's his signature there. That was quite a moment for me. Because if you're from the working classes in our side of Stalybridge, Ashton, that side of Manchester, people just didn't keep written records. You know, there wasn't the time to sit and write about yourself and be all self-indulgent. And so the only things that were ever kept from him were in the town council minutes. But I should go back a little bit as well and say one of the reasons why this story was so profound and so important to our family was because 10 years before this discovery, my own brother had converted to Islam in 1990. So instantly he saw that this was just an incredible thing to have happened. He thought he was the only person in his family ever who was a white person who'd made this decision, and it turns out his own great-great-great-grandfather had. So it was a heck of a story, and something that I am very committed now to, I suppose, sharing with as many people as I can do. But I'm going to focus on two quick themes in this talk today. The first one is religion in the northwest of England, and it's something that I'm particularly interested in. And if you are from the northwest of England, you might already be familiar with some of the themes that I'm talking about. Beautiful picture up there, the Industrial Revolution view of Stalybridge, visited by Engels himself, best friend of Marx, who thought the place was a loathsome area. Mucky, dirty, horrible, people treated absolutely appallingly terribly. And Robert came to live in Stalybridge and Ashton in 1838 when he was 10 years old. But they'd moved to Cardiff, so that's where Robert was born. And he was sent back up north to live with his rich uncle John Stanley, who was an extremely interesting character. So John Stanley had made a fortune from the Industrial Revolution. He was in iron. He made the iron machinery, so he made the power looms that drove the factories that produced the cotton. And Manchester at the time, I always say this one, Manchester was not even referred to as Manchester. It was known throughout the world as King Cotton. This is Lancashire. This is where the money was at this point in history. And the beginnings, I think, and I might be wrong on this, we can talk about this later, but the beginnings of Robert's journey seem to begin with a very unusual sect called the Christian Israelites. Now, again, we knew nothing about this. We are not, apart from my brother doing what he did, we're not a particularly religious family until this point in time. But we found out that Robert had been married in the Christian Israelite church in Ashton. Now, if you're from Ashton and you're into your local history, you will immediately know the significance of this. And I could talk for another 3 hours on this, but I won't do. Suffice to say, they were a millennialist sect. They believed that Christ was going to appear in their own lifetime. And this was their leader, a very charismatic, very controversial person called John Rowe, or Prophet John Rowe. And this was the sanctuary, the temple, the church that he had built, which was bankrolled by Robert's uncle John Stanley, which in today's prices cost £750,000. Now, John Rowe basically created some new rules for his church. He'd taken over a group called the Southcottians, who were also a very unusual Christian sect, and he returned them to Mosaic law. He introduced, they all had to eat kosher, all the men had to wear beards, they had to wear certain types of clothes, the men were circumcised, and this is the church that Robert was married in. This is a church that he belonged to and he grew up in. Now, at the age of 19, Robert left Ashton. So he did his apprenticeship as a very young grocer. He went to live in Stalybridge with his new wife, and he set up his own grocer's shop, and he sold tea as well as other grocery products. And he decided then to join the Anglican Church. Again, I go into this a bit in the book as to why this happened. But the bit that I would also emphasize is this is his background of Christianity, really. There was something called the Battle of the Two St. Georges in Stalybridge, which fascinated me because this is really the kind of family church that we were connected to. That's old St. George's up there, which is no longer there, but you can still visit it on the hillside. You can still visit the graves. This is New St. George's, where I used to be a member of the church choir. And there was a huge falling out between the two vicars of both churches, both called St. George's, both vying for the money from the local people who would pay to sit in the pews because you paid a pew rent. And every day for about a year, the vicars would almost come to blows over who would get to say the sermon, over who would get to do the communion. The churches were barricaded, the doors were knocked down, the wardens were fighting. Thousands of people would turn up early in the morning to the churchyard at Old St. George's to watch all of this. I mean, there was no Netflix in those days. It's let's go to the local Christian church and watch them all displaying very unchristian behaviour. And this came to, this was actually mentioned in Parliament, the disgraceful behaviour of people in Stalybridge. So this is really the context that Robert came into. But also, if you're from the Northwest, you'll be very aware of the fact that sectarianism is a massive issue. It was a massive issue, it still can be a massive issue. And in 1868, a really loathsome man called Murphy came over from Ireland, bringing with him the most horrible anti-Catholic sentiment. He toured the country, just trashing Roman Catholicisms, and there were riots in various towns in the country. It was extremely violent in Stalybridge and Ashton, and in particular because during the 1850s and the 1860s, as a result of the Great Famine in Ireland, the population swelled to the degree that by this point in time, nearly 50% of the people living in Stalybridge and Ashton were newly arrived Irish immigrants. So again, this is the stuff that was happening at the time that Robert was growing up and becoming a young man. Going back a little bit to radical 19th century Manchester, this is a political bit I'll just skim over really. Some of you might be aware of the fact that we had something called the Plug Riots or the General Strike in 1842. Again, this is all a result of oppression during the Industrial Revolution and people rising up against the wage reductions, and this is the beginning of the union movement and the unions being crushed. There was also something called the anti-poor law movement. This is all about people were being forced into the workhouses. If you know anything about Oliver Twist, you'll know what was going on at this point in time. And factory reform, in particular with regard to the children's lives, because the children were down mines, they were up chimneys, or in factories for 12, 14, 16 hours a day with barely a day off. And people were extremely concerned and campaigning against this at this point in time. So these were the hot potato issues that Robert was growing up around. Chartism, the drive for people's votes, universal suffrage, challenging the way that people were elected into power, challenging how many people had the vote. Robert really got his teeth into this issue, and he was even invited to Parliament as he became more and more well known. He was appointed a magistrate, and he went down to Parliament in 1869 to give his view on whether working men, as the vote was introduced to them, should be allowed to have the secret ballot or whether it should be out in public, where they could easily be bribed or threatened. The Lancashire cotton famine was something that really struck me during this research. I had no idea about this issue. I was never taught about this at school, neither were my parents, even though we had the bread riots in 1863 in Stalybridge. This was a direct result of President Lincoln's blockade of the cotton trade. So he was stopping the cotton from coming all the way up to Manchester in particular, because he wanted to break the back of the economic might of the South so he could win the Civil War and end slavery. But this led directly to a famine in Lancashire. People died, it was horrible. Some of the towns were like ghost towns. There was no work for 3 years. Most of the mills had to shut down. The rich men went bankrupt, most of them, but the poor people were starving to death. And this actually led to a bread riot in Stalybridge. This picture is an illustration from a newspaper rather at the time. No photographs in those days. My dad actually had this newspaper, which was astonishing. And he'd been told that it had been Robert Stanley's. Robert Stanley hadn't written on it or indicated why he'd kept it, or why his sons or his daughters had passed it down. But what we did one Sunday morning, we got the census and we traced exactly where Robert's shop was in Stalybridge, and you can see it here. And that's New St George's there in the background on top of the hill. You can walk down that street today. This here, that's my dad and my son there in front of what was Robert's shop. And we realised by looking at this illustration over here, you can see here it says tea. So this is Robert's shop, and Robert's shop is being broken into and looted. And the one oral history memory that has been passed down through generations from Robert was he remembered the bread riots, and he remembered telling everybody to throw the food out the window because the shops were getting broken in and looted because the people were so sick and tired of being treated the way that they had been treated, and they were protesting. I mean, this is 1863. Everybody knows about Peterloo in 1819. You've got the same scenario here. Men on horseback with swords slicing at the people who are writing because they're hungry. So this is a little bit now about him. I like to call him the grocer mayor, but he had all of these domestic interests that I've just explained to you about. But the difference between Robert and a lot of people of his generation was that he not only had big outside interests, but he also engaged with them directly. And this was probably because of his time spent at the Corn Exchange in Manchester when he was buying tea off tea suppliers who had come from overseas. That's the original old Corn Exchange in Manchester. But when Quillian interviewed him in that little magazine that I was talking about at the beginning, Robert explained, this is basically Robert's version of his journey to Islam, and it was a very, very logical explanation. There was no emotion in there. It was criticism of Christianity and criticism of the British government, but he mentions David Urquhart, who is quite a key person, really. Even though he would never converted to Islam, he was a big influencer in Robert's view of the world. He was a Turkophile. He was sent out to Turkey as a diplomat, basically to spy on Turkey. And he came back to England saying, sorry guys, you've got this wrong. You know, I completely see what's going on here, and I'm a big supporter of the Ottoman Empire and of the Caliph. The other thing about Robert is, on the home front, he was what you would call a municipal socialist. So even though he was a Tory, the two parties at this time were the Liberals and the Conservatives, because there wasn't a Labour Party around at this time. Municipal socialism was a big movement to try and improve public health and improve the lot of the poor, basically. So he did things like he headed up the building of Stalybridge Market Hall here, producing a wonderful market, getting clean water from Dovestones Reservoir, which I'm sure some of you have visited, a very beautiful place nearby. The parks, he was a trustee of Stamford Park. He was one of the original trustees about the park building movement. But after he was elected mayor, because he became mayor for 2 periods, in the second period, he became involved in something called the Bulgarian atrocities, when thousands of Christians were killed in Bulgaria by Turkish soldiers. And this just caused absolute national outrage. And Robert was very much dragged into this situation because across the land, mayors were being told they had to call a meeting to condemn what had gone on. And this went on and on. And Robert said, I'm not calling meeting. He stood up in Manchester and you know, he was really vilified for this, because he said, the measures have been put in place to stop this from happening ever again. If I call a meeting, I'm playing into your hands politically. I don't want to do that. So I've said what I've got to say. People were really not happy with this. And you can imagine the wealthy men of the towns, the way that they treated him after this. You know, what an upstart to actually say, I'm not doing that. At that point, I think he decided he'd had enough of local politics. And this is a great bit. He said, okay, I'm not going to be in local politics anymore. I'm going to be a pub landlord. So that's what he did. And this is the pub that he was a pub landlord of, the New Inn in Ashton-under-Lyne. It's still there. And he was a pub landlord for 18 years. And I just think that's fascinating, because at the time he was a pub landlord, he started writing to the Caliph Abdul Hamid II, like you do when you're running a pub in Ashton. And he was advising him on things like agriculture, manufacturing, even military. I mean, to have received letters from this guy in Ashton must have been quite an extraordinary thing. And he even asked for a new English translation of the Quran, because he said, I can't trust this Quran that obviously people were telling him to read because it's written by a Christian. Can we please get the translation done by a Muslim into English? And I just thought it was an incredible thing for him to have done. But at the same time as well, he was lobbying the British government on the foreign policy, on the way that they were treating Muslims. And you can find all of this out through reading the editions of the Crescent, because his letters were in there. Quillian printed his letters. Then he moved to Manchester. So he left Ashton, he sold the pub, and he moved to Manchester in 1897. At this point, he got involved with Abdullah Quillian, who I was going to talk a little bit more about, and he converted to Islam. He said Shahada in April 1898, and he obviously became very close, good friends with Quillian, who was 28 years younger than Robert. And Quillian decided to appoint him as vice chairman of the Liverpool Mosque. And at this point, his name changes to Reschid. You see his name as Reschid in the copies of the Crescent. And that's a photograph of the interior of the mosque. And this is a wonderful photograph, like one of the only other photographs that we have of him sitting there behind Quillian, which a friend pointed out. I'd never seen this photograph. And he said, isn't that your great-great-great-grandfather? And if you've ever seen my dad, there's a picture of him at the end, then you'll know, wow, that is clearly him. That's him down to a T. And then he moved back to Stalybridge. So Quillian left the country for various reasons, which very much to do with World War I approaching and affiliations with Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, who sided with the Germans at the beginning of the First World War. And he moved back to Stalybridge when Quillian left the country. This is the house that he lived in, which is still there on Wakefield Road. And he died in that house, and then there was silence. He was buried here. This is his gravestone at St Paul's Church in Stalybridge. That's his gravestone, which sadly isn't there anymore because we only found out about where he was. We managed to get this photograph, and then the graves were all demolished to make way for building a car park, and sadly we were not able to get permission to keep the gravestone. So then we had silence for 100 years, and it took my dad doing a bit of basic everyday family history information to unravel the beginnings of this incredible story. So I'll finish now with a lovely picture of my family, some of my family anyway. They're in the mosque in Liverpool, thanks to the Abdullah Quillian Society, who were very kind to us on that day. And yeah, like Professor Seddon just said, I've written a historical biography, basic, straightforward facts. If you love your facts, this is the one to get your teeth into. But then I wanted to write something that filled the gaps, because everybody always says, but what about his wife? But what about his daughters? But what about this? What do you think his real reason was for converting? So I wanted to do some more imaginative stuff, put my interpretation from my research into building up a fuller picture of Robert. That's a book called Imagining Robert. And there's that one. And here's a much awaited promised picture of my dad. My dad stars in a little trailer for the project, really, and the books that I've written. He's the image of Robert Reschid Stanley. I'm sure many of you would agree. And we filmed it at the British Muslim Heritage Centre. Arakan Creative Media filmed that for us. And that was a wonderful gift from them. So if you're interested, you want to find out more, there is a website, and that's really kind of like a family website, but also a project website, because what I like to do with this history is to try and bring people from different backgrounds together to examine these issues, to talk about class and religion and politics, and just to get people talking a little bit more. So it's wonderful to be here today and sharing this with you. And I'm sorry I had to rush that, but Yahya's got far more to tell you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. That's a wonderful presentation. I'm sure people who are unfamiliar with the story of Robert Reschid Stanley will be fascinated, and I'm sure it's going to generate a lot of questions. Your very well-timed, very well-presented presentation, Chris, leads us very nicely, dovetails us, in fact, into our next speaker, Yahya Birt, who Yahya, like Chris, I've known for many years now. and through our shared interests as well, and our shared love of discovering this kind of hidden Victorian Muslim history that's coming to light through the research of people like Chris and Yahya himself. Yahya has authored on aspects of British Islam and British Muslims. At the moment, he is, we didn't speak about this, but I think he's now in the final stages of completing his PhD, which is looking at the development, I think, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong on this. The last time we spoke about it, it was looking at the development of Islamic movements in the UK, but he may have tweaked that slightly. He also, like myself, worked for a time with Cube Publishing in Leicestershire, which published Professor Ron Jeeves's book on Abdullah Quillian, which is going to be the topic of Yahya's presentation. Yahya was the kind of commissioning editor of that publication, and that book has been again another kind of milestone in the history of marking out British Muslims and British Islam. Yahya has done further research through his networks and friends and colleagues, and has produced and is about to publish, the release date is very soon, he will tell us, a kind of travel log from a late 19th century, early 20th century Turkish Muslim who came and spent some time with the Liverpool Muslim community under the tutorage of Sheikh Abdullah Quillian. And I think that's probably more than enough. You can Google Yahya and you'll get lots more correct information than I've given. So are you ready to join us, Yahya?
Yes, I am. Thanks. First of all, I'd really like to thank you, Dr. Seddon, and I'm really honoured to be sharing this platform with Christina, whose work I think is wonderful way of opening up hidden histories of Islam in Victorian England that even families didn't suspect, as Christina's story so marvelously shows. And also, I'd really like to thank MACFEST for inviting us. If I sit forward, is that better? Can you hear me better now? I'm getting complaints. Okay, but anyway,
that's clearer.
Okay, that's better. Yeah. Okay. So it'd be nice if we could hand over to the slide, the first slide. Okay, so this is a project that I've done with two colleagues, Riordan McNamara and Munira Mcdosolo, and basically we found a colleague found a travelogue, a single copy of which has survived in the University of Ankara library. So this was last year, and when we saw this this document, it was 112 pages, and it was called "Is the Islam at Liverpool?" That's what I'll show you a picture of it later. So obviously we were very excited, and Munira said that she was happy to start working on it, and after 5 months of very hard effort, we finished in December, polishing up the translation, writing a long introduction to explain the text, and providing some original source material as well from the Ottoman archives and elsewhere. So we're really sort of happy with it, and hopefully that's going to be out in March. That's the plan. So I'm going to give you kind of a taste of the book, of the travelogue, and so let's dive into the next slide. If we can dive into the next slide, that would be great. So this was Yusuf, Sami, Asmai, and he was the he's the author. We don't know his birth date, but I think it's probably going to be, would have been sometime in the 1860s, probably. And he was madrasa trained in Adana in Turkey. At the age of 20, was sent to teach Turkish at a school in near Cairo, and he spent the rest of his life in Cairo. But he didn't remain a teacher. He became a journalist. He established a newspaper, Misr, and also, most relevantly for us, he became a travel writer. He traveled twice to England, wrote a separate travelogue of his journey to England in 1891. But as this account tells us, his friends back in Cairo criticized him and said, how can you go to England and not visit the Liverpool Muslims? How can you not go meet Sheikh Abdullah Quillian? He, in the first chapter of the book, he really gives us a very good idea of how famous the Liverpool Muslims were. So he basically said, as soon as the community was established, news used to appear weekly, almost weekly, if not daily at times, in the Turkish press. And he said, so a trickle of information sort of percolated over the years, and it became quite the subject of discussion in Cairo, which he kind of alludes to, and says basically some people took it all at face values, others were more skeptical. Some even thought that it might be a political move by the British, because Egypt had been taken over by the British in the previous decade, and so the wounds of having been taken over were still raw, understandably raw amongst the Egyptians. And what's clear from this is that Asmai himself had a fairly low opinion of the. So I don't know why we've changed the slide. Can we go back to Asmai, please? He had a fairly low opinion of the British, and that comes through in his description of British society in the second chapter. While he admired their science and their technology and the freedom, religious freedom in England, he didn't think much of its morals. So anyway, he comes in 1895, determined to spend and spends 33 days with the Liverpool Muslims, and it's a remarkably thorough effort. I mean, he wasn't an academic by any means, but he interviewed as all the members of the institute that he met. He had long interviews with Quillian. He sat in on religious services and lectures. He spoke to other local people nearby, including other visiting Muslims, other Ottoman intellectuals who were there. He even talked to a couple of local priests, and he read all the literature he could. And he also was in correspondence with members of the Institute after he left Liverpool to go back to Cairo. So basically he was, it was a pretty amazingly thorough piece of work. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So let me just flesh out a little bit about what Christina said about Abdullah Quillian, for those of you who may not know who he was, but he was probably the most significant figure in British Islam in the 19th century. He declares his Islam in 1887, and he starts calling to Islam amongst the local people of Liverpool. And progress is slow at the beginning, but a fledgling community emerges, and then he moves to a house on Brown Terrace, and they set up a mosque there, and they begin to have regular meetings. Quillian himself, he had a double career as a lawyer and a journalist, and He came from a non-conformist background, and his family were staunch supporters of the temperance movement. So Quillian never drank alcohol in his life even before becoming Muslim. So if we can go on to the next slide. So these are a couple of pictures that have been unearthed recently, and they show the Liverpool Muslim community, I would say from the early 1890s, early to mid 1890s. We don't know the exact date, but basically it was comprised of two elements. You had people who had converted to Islam, and then you had a floating population of sailors, Muslim sailors, and other visitors who would be coming in and out of this great port city of Liverpool, and would hear of the mosque and would visit and stay for a while and maybe go back out on the ships again. And in this way, news of the Liverpool community and the Liverpool Mosque spread very quickly through the through the kind of shipping lanes of the British Empire, which, as we know, extended all the way to Bengal, Australia, India, Gujarat, Yemen, the Suez Canal, North Africa, and so on. So news of this community spread far and wide, and this is Asmai is a witness to this. We can also see in the second picture on the right, Quillian standing with 6 of his children, and we think 2 of his wives standing to his right. Well, yeah, to our right. So if we can go on to the next slide. So the next sort of character that Asmai meets when he gets there, gets to Liverpool, is he meets an American convert to Islam, Nafisa Keep, and because Asmai's English was passable but not very fluent, he was reliant on Nafisa Keep to translate everything into French for him, which he was fluent in. Now, Nafisa Keep is an important character in our story. She was an American convert to Islam who'd only converted a few years previously in 1893. Prior to that, she'd been a journalist. She'd been a foreign correspondent in Paris for 4 years. And she had helped Charles Keep set up the New York News, sorry, the Wall Street News, with some of her family's own money. Things had gone wrong. He had an affair and a family with another woman, and they had been divorced. And she even was taking him to court to retrieve the money, but he died in the interim, and she never got her money back. And so after that, she started to explore Islam and other faiths, and eventually became a Muslim. Worked for another prominent American convert to Islam. His name was Alexander Russell Webb, and worked for him before falling out with him on the basis that she felt he was financially dishonest and was actually not preaching Orthodox Islam, but a kind of hybrid Islam. She was a smart, independent person, independently minded person. She probably knew more about Islamic practices and law than her generation of converts, because she had spent her early years studying the Hidayah, which was a Hanafi law compendium translated into English for use under Anglo-Mohammedan law in the British Empire. And after 6 months in Liverpool, she'd arrived in February of 1895. By the time Asmai had come from Cairo and met her, she was becoming increasingly disgruntled. She felt she would, first of all, considered that Quillian was not teaching the converts Orthodox Islam, and that many of the prayer practices and the social mores were still very un-Islamic. And to that end, just before Asmai had arrived, she had started to write to some of the Muslim authorities about the community and what she saw as its problems. We don't have a photograph of her. We haven't been able to find one. If anybody comes across one, do send it through, as we'd love to have a picture of her. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So another person who was here was Maulana Barakatullah, and he was an Indian Islamic scholar and a famous anti-imperialist activist, and had come to London in 1887, and then come up to Liverpool in 1893, where he worked as an imam, an educator, a writer and publicist at the Institute. Now he was, what this new account tells us is how important Barakatullah was in connecting the Liverpool Muslims to the Afghan court in particular. And we think it was through a letter writing campaign to Muslim rulers and to Muslim philanthropists in 3 languages, Arabic, Turkish and Urdu, that Barakatullah was writing to all these different figures in the Muslim world, and had his greatest success with the Emir of Afghanistan, who the previous year had written to Quillian a letter of support and had called him sort of the leader of the believers in England. So again, here's another important character. So if we can go now to the next slide. So so what had just happened just before Asmai had arrived, through Barakatullah's letter writing, the Crown Prince of Afghanistan had visited the Liverpool Mosque and given a generous sum of £2,500 to build the mosque. Now he was a young man who was only 20 at the time. His father had been the one whom Victoria had invited for an official state tour, but his father, Abdurrahman, was too ill to travel. So he sent his second son, Nasrullah, in his stead. Now, certainly because Quillian and the Liverpool Muslims were already in touch with the Afghan court, it was by those efforts, I think, that Nasrullah decided to visit Liverpool and to spend a day with the Muslims and to give this large bequest. What was very, very, very interesting about this visit is that at the time, the British wanted to invest in Afghanistan, but they regarded Nasrullah's father, Abdurrahman, as a bit of a stick in the mud. He didn't want to accept British investments, whereas Nasrullah, as the young prince, was much more open. And what's very interesting is that when Quillian makes his reception speech in the mosque, when the prince is there, he actually talks about the benefits of progressive education and science and modern learning. And that speech is also delivered in Persian by Barakatullah. Translation is delivered to the prince and his entourage of 40 in the mosque. So clearly Quillian here was echoing British imperial interests in making this allusion. We can speculate as to why the Afghans placed so much importance on the Liverpool Muslims, that it may well be that they wanted to sort of make a point about seeing they could build fraternal relations with the British by emphasizing the fact that there was a Muslim community in Britain. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is what I showed you, talked earlier, that this is the page on the left. This is the surviving copy which we found in Turkey, and on the right this is the translation that we're going to bring out, and I've introduced some of the characters to you. Let me say a little bit about more finish on what Asmai sort of says. So Asmai, I think that there were basically 3 main criticisms that Asmai had of the community. The first was that he felt that Quillian, the way that Quillian had taught the converts, he'd given them a sort of a hybridized system of worship from what he witnessed, and so it was a kind of mixture of a sort of a Protestant service with some Islamic elements to it. And he describes this in great detail in the book in a very interesting way. And certainly the way in which this was understood was a kind of interpretive tussle, I think, between Asmai and Quillian. And it may be that Asmai may not have fully understood Quilliam's intent. So first of all was a kind of the lack of orthodox Islamic practice at the Institute was a concern for Asmai. The second thing that really was a concern for Asmai was the sort of political argument between them, which again they have when Quilliam takes Asmai to visit the printing press. So the famous thing about the Institute was that it published its own newspapers, the Crescent, 800 issues between 1893 and 1908. It came out weekly. It was sent all over the Muslim world, and there was also a monthly, the Islamic World. So while they're arguing at the printing press, and basically Quilliam is arguing that English is a new Islamic language, it's a new way to connect Muslims, and in fact, it's the most effective way to do it, and that all Muslims of different sects, different backgrounds, all could be united by working through this medium of English, and because they had a religious liberty in England and advantages of a free press, then they could be very forthright in their opinions and what they wanted to say. Asmai takes a sort of much more traditional line. He's sort of Ottoman traditionalist, if you like, and he sort of says, well, you know, it's the problem is that really Muslims always look to Istanbul, they look to the Caliph, and they look to the great Islamic languages like Arabic, and that is how you will unite the Muslims. So this is kind of an argument they were having. I think that because Quilliam's venture was so new and so unprecedented, it was hard to imagine that English could be what it is today, which is a great Islamic language of the modern world. But back in the 1890s, it didn't appear to have that potential, perhaps. The other difference, I think, is that Quilliam saw his role as the Sheikh al-Islam of the British Isles. He saw his role as a mediation role, if you like, between the Muslims of the British Empire and, if you like, the Muslims in the independent rulers in the independent Muslim states, most notably the Ottomans. So he wanted a concordat between the British and the Ottoman empires. But for Asmai, that was sort of too Anglophile a view. And the reason why he thought that was too Anglophile a view was that he felt that this didn't account for the British invasion and takeover of Egypt, which had only, to be honest, only happened in the previous decade. And while it was noted that in the following year, Quilliam made a very big protest about the extension of British imperial power into the Sudan, he had been notably silent over Egypt. And I think this accounts for some of the political differences in how Asmai and Quilliam saw Islamic solidarity working in trying to recover dignity, if you like, and freedom from European colonial rule, and particularly that of the British Empire. The final major criticism of Asmai was really on Quilliam's personal competence and even his personal integrity. And I won't go into that today because that's another long discussion. But all in all, it's a fascinating document. It really gives you a amazing bird's eye view, eyewitness account of this fascinating community of converts in Liverpool. And what makes it so refreshing is that it's a Muslim point of view. So quite often Quilliam is battling against, if you like, non-Muslim skeptics. But what makes this account so refreshing is that you get the kind of sense of internal Muslim debate, the great religious and political debates of the age. It really comes through in this text, and that's what makes it so unique. And I really hope that people get a chance to read it because it's a fantastic read. It's very witty, very engaging text. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I've overrun, Sid, but that's me done. I'm done.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you, Yahya. Just saying, you're slightly ahead of yourself, if anything, but it just gives us more time to take and field more questions and discussion, etc. What I want to say before I start convening the questions from our participants and from our audience this evening is that this particular session is scheduled to finish at 7:30, and it will do that in spite of our discussions. So I want to apologize to everybody that if suddenly at 7:30 we're through the middle of some kind of discussion or some important answer and suddenly the whole thing cuts out, that isn't by intention. It's just the way that the system that we're using works. So that's a precursor if we do find ourselves in that situation. So we have at the moment two fielded questions. One from Haroon Sherwani, which is not that specific. In fact, it relates to another character who's slightly before both Quillian and, of course, Reschid Stanley. But it's a question about he says, Haroon, but I wonder if you have looked at the other Victorian Muslim Stanley, which of course he's referring to Lord Stanley of Alderley. There are a few published references to Lord Stanley in works that are out there. There isn't a publication that I know that deals exclusively with Lord Stanley at the moment, but I'm sure with the kind of corpus of research work that's coming out, I'm sure somebody along the line is going to dedicate a single research publication to Lord Stanley. But I'd be interested in feedback from both Chris and Yahya to Haroon's question.
Yeah, I don't mind saying I found Henry Stanley absolutely fascinating as a person, and as you've just said, there doesn't seem to be enough on this man who just absolutely rocked the establishment with what he did. I was really lucky because my dad, bless him, who squirrels away books, he says, don't read books, but he squirrels them away, and then he presents them with me at just the right time in my life. And this is, I don't know if you can see it, but this is a very, very old version of the Stanleys of Alderley. So I absolutely scoured this one. I've done the bad thing of bending back all the corners. I shouldn't have done that, but I was fascinated as to what his family made of his conversion, and it really turned me off his family because they were not nice, you know. For whatever reasons, they didn't get on. You know, some horrible things were said about him after he died. There were lots of, you know, when money happens, people behave very badly. And it's fascinating to see how they just ridiculed him, how they just, you know, they were very condescending. They were very, very, very racist. And no matter what he did, I'm not making any judgment on him. We need to have a lot more research done into his life. He was an incredible character. And yeah, I would absolutely agree with you. I mean, I've had so many people get the Lord Stanley and our Stanley confused, but you know, we're from the same part of the world, and it's quite obvious that they would have met each other probably in Liverpool at the mosque, and I like to think that they probably would have found it quite amusing to have the name in common, and also to have done something so unusual and so groundbreaking in their own very different communities from their own very different parts of the world. And it is strange if you think about it. Here's me saying, oh yeah, you know, you're working class, nobody ever looks at your history, nobody cares. Look at Henry Stanley, you know, how much more you know, prominent can you be as a person in society? And yet again, his story's been ignored. So if anybody wants to, I haven't got time to do this. If anybody wants to take on that, and we can do the two Stanleys comparison. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can think of, if you want to read up on Stanley, is the first chapter of Jamie Gillam's book, Loyal Enemies. There's a chapter the first chapter is Britain's first peer of the realm, Henry Stanley and Islam in Victorian Britain. And as far as I know, that's 40 pages. Sorry, 30 pages. As far as I know, that is the longest account of Stanley anywhere. I don't know if you agree with me, Dr. Seddon, but
you're absolutely right. I mean, there are bits of scattered, and some of it is quite anachronistic information about Stanley. He was buried on his head, and all these kind of misnomers about what happened to him. He was actually buried and is buried in the family grounds. I think very close to the A34, if I'm correct. But his grave is kind of it's not accessible to the public. Let's put it that way. His brother Algernon referred to Henry Stanley as a dog.
Yeah.
So that's what his family, relating to what Chris said about how his family mistreated him. But he was also married, unfortunately, to a serial serial bigamist. He married a Spanish wife who and they had 3 marriages in all, one in a Christian church, one at a register office, and an Islamic nikah. But she was still married to a guy in Spain. She came from a kind of countess family, the kind of higher echelons of Spanish society, as it were. But she was actually a serial bigamist, so quite interesting. But yeah, more needs to be written. Jamie's work is a starting point, and thank you for flagging that up, Yahya. If anybody wants to start research on Lord Stanley, then Jamie's book is the place to start. Thank you very much. I'll move on to the next question now. I'm taking them systematically. They are coming in quite thick and fast now. This is from Hasib Khan, who asks, he says that the presentations, they said that was fascinating. Do we have much detail on the Muslim Lascar community in Liverpool and how they interacted with the Liverpool Muslim Institute? Yahya, I'll let you take this one first.
I feel scared to say anything about Lascars in your presence, because Dr. Seddon has written a wonderful book called The Last of the Lascars, which I urge all of you to go and check out at some point. But yeah, certainly from what I know, Quillian was a lawyer, and a lot of his work involved helping the urban poor in one way, shape, form or another. He was a trade unionist of some standing, and a part of his work was looking after the legal rights and the pastoral needs of the Lascars. So the Lascars was a kind of an anglicized term for the Oriental sailor. It comes originally from al-askari, which means soldier. And basically it could refer to anybody could be somebody from Bengal, it could be Yemeni, it could be an Egyptian, it could be a Moroccan, but basically anybody coming, being picked up as part of the British Imperial Maritime Trades, picked up as a seaman, employed on the steamships in very poor conditions for low pay, and then they would wind up in these great ports. And so in fact, the first Muslim communities, as Dr. Seddon shows in his work and others have done, were in the ports, and they were, they started with the Lascars really, amongst also there were the cotton traders of Manchester, but basically you were talking about seaports, and Liverpool was no exception. And so Quillian and his community interacted with the Lascars in 2 ways. First, as a lawyer, Quillian defended them, wrote to the shipping companies and made sure that if any Lascar had died at sea, okay, that his unpaid wages would be sent back to his family back home. So he was very assiduous about this, and they took his letters very seriously and would pay attention to them, because they were notorious for not paying what they owed. The second way he he interacted, and he is community actor with community. They acted in a pastoral way. He acted as their imam. So if any Lascar was ill, they would visit him in hospital. If they passed away, they would give them an Islamic burial and look after their needs. And what's really notable is that when in 1908, when the Liverpool Muslim Institute closed its doors, that in the next few years, there was some quite upsetting, quite plaintive letters written asking for help and support from some surviving members of the Liverpool Muslim community, saying we need to help the Lascars. They're not getting the support that they used to get. And it wouldn't be for a number of decades before, if you like, those Lascars themselves self-organized and started to create their own community structures. Now you have the Ar-Rahma Mosque in Liverpool, which really is the outcome of their efforts in later decades.
Chris, thank you. Yahya, anything you'd like to add? Is your mic on, Chris? Okay.
No, that was a no.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, if I could just add that Quillian did publish intermittently, as Yahya said, on the state of Lascars in Britain, who were often abandoned once they got a commission on a ship to Britain. And in fact, in one of the Crescent publications, there's a little story called Lascars Adrift, in which Quillian reports a kind of a fracas that broke out in Barrow-on-Furness between celebrating Muslim Lascars and local Barrow-on-Furness lads. The Lascars were celebrating what seems to be Eid prayer, and in the celebrations, a hat was knocked off. We don't know if it was a Lascar hat or a hat of one of the local lads, but then there was a bit of toing and froing and a bit of a scrap broke out. But Quillian used that incident to lead to the fact that the Lascars were unrepresented in Britain, and he said it was a shame that they were actually subjects of the crown, which of course they were, coming from the colonial outposts of the British Empire. So let's take another question, because there are quite a few here. Let me just, what have we got? Oh yes, we've got Barbara Daniola, I think it is, if I'm pronouncing that correct. And she asks, how significant do you think the Ottoman archives are in order to find out more about Islam in Britain during this era? Chris, you're on camera, so why don't you kick off?
How significant they are?
Yeah.
The Ottoman archives. I don't know, because I've never been able to access them, but I'm sure they are significant. I had it up to here, just in the local archives. So my dream would to be just to uncover more information about Robert Stanley. And I think the question that I always get asked is, where are those letters that he wrote, copies of letters that he wrote to Abdul Hamid? I would love to find out any correspondence. I'm pretty sure he would have had letters back, but where they've gone, I don't know. And so I always say, if there is anybody, who was going to be able to access the archives, if they could, on behalf of me, on behalf of my family, just keep an eye out for that. We would be so grateful.
Well, I think now that we have a very sympathetic Turkish government that's sensitive to its and proud of its Ottoman roots, I have read that the archives relating to Quillian and British Islam during this period were kept at the Palace of Yildiz, which was the summer palace just further up the Bosphorus from Topkapi Palace by the sultans. So perhaps if we made some kind of formal approach to the Turkish government, we might be allowed access, unlimited access, and hopefully we could get funding for it to try to explore these archives. I made a recent visit, and I was very lucky. I just made it back in time before the curfew to Istanbul, in fact, but I just didn't have time to follow up the leads that I had, but I'm hoping to go back. Yahya, you probably have something to say on this.
Well, I'd like to name check the doctoral research of Matt Sharp at the University of Pennsylvania. He looked at the at mentions of Quilliam in the Ottoman archives, has sort of done the groundwork there, as well as work he's worked on Alexander Russell Webb. But he found something like 200 documents in the Ottoman archives relating to the Liverpool Muslims and to Quilliam. What's fascinating, speaking of letters, Christine, actually some of Quilliam's letters to the Ottomans survive and are in the Ottoman archives, where he writes, quite personal details about his family and what's happening in Liverpool and so on, writing to the Caliph. So that there's quite a lot of correspondence about the Liverpool Muslims between the Ottoman consul of Liverpool, because obviously Liverpool was a great trading port. So the Ottomans were interested in building their trade. So they had trade consuls in Liverpool and also in Manchester. And so, it was, and actually Quilliam's oldest son, Robert Ahmed Quilliam, was educated in Turkey and was later employed became an Ottoman official and was employed as the vice Ottoman consul in Liverpool later on. So he also gets mentioned a lot in the Ottoman archives as well. But I would, in a more general sense, I would go so far as to say that some of the most important information about the early history of Muslims and Islam in Britain lies in languages and archives outside of Britain itself. So I think that we have more to discover in Urdu, Farsi, Turkish, and Arabic. I'm almost certain we're going to find more, and certainly working on this text has made me ever more convinced that that is the new frontier in doing research in this period.
I think you're spot on there, Yahya, because I remember reading from copies of the Crescent that colonial converts to Islam, that is people working in the colonial government in India who originate from Britain but had been shipped out there to work for the government, were sending their questions to Quilliam rather than seeking answers to their questions to local ulama within Delhi or wherever it was, Bombay, wherever they were based. These Victorian converts were actually sending their questions back to England to get a fatwa or some guidance from Quilliam. So there must be at least somewhere, languishing in some libraries or some private archives somewhere in India, some references to these characters and their links with the Liverpool Muslim community. So I think you're absolutely right. That leads me to another question, and this is from Khaisra, and she asks, why is it that it appears to be, and Chris, I think you are more qualified to take this than anyone. She asks, why is it that the descendants of these Victorian Muslim converts did not follow their family into Islam?
That's a very good question, and I do get asked that as quite a bit. And I think, I can only really speak for Robert and why as far as we know, until 100 years later, some strange twist of fate had my brother converted to Islam. I think a lot of his story was due to the fact that when you were from a mill town in Lancashire at this point in history, and nobody's ever done that before, and you are quite an unusual personality to have taken these steps anyway. I think if you think about how late on it was in his life, he was 69 when he said Shahada, and as was his wife, and his daughters were becoming middle-aged, and he had grandchildren, probably getting ready for great-grandchildren. To then expect his entire family to have followed the decision that he had made, I think is just unrealistic in that part of the world. There is no culture, there's no tradition of that, you know, after all these years that you've been in a family, to following something that the head, the household, as you like, does. So its tradition, its culture is quite different. But also, if you think about it, you know, it's a time of the world where, you know, the Ottoman Empire was struggling, and, you know, we're approaching World War I. So I think a lot of it is the cultural reasons. But I think as well, having looked into his personality as much as I've been able to, he was not somebody that imposed his beliefs on other people. He absolutely came back to live in Stalybridge, you know, not a Muslim town. You know, he wouldn't have been able to have a mosque to pray in Manchester. Professor Seddon, you can talk a little bit more about this. There would have been places to go to pray. So he was at ease being around, completely surrounded by Christians, and it wasn't, I don't think it was an issue for him at all. And he certainly, you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe his family just were at ease with, that's what Dad does, this is what we do.
But in a way, there is another part, if you don't mind, Yahya. There is an extension to your answer, Chris, and that is that, you know, 4 or 5 generations down the line, Robert Reschid's family did convert to Islam because of your brother's conversion, of course. So maybe there is something genetic, of course. Who knows?
I think
so
one of the interesting things that came up in our research for the book, because we tried to, the book, it's Asmai's travelogue focuses on the Liverpool Muslim community, not just on Quillian. And so what we tried to do is we did quite a lot of archival work on 12 different members of the Liverpool Muslim Institute, and looked at their backgrounds, where they were born, what their religious background was, you know, anything we could find about them, you know, where they were buried and so on. And what's really quite interesting is that in one case, for instance, we had somebody from a kind of I would say a kind of a Orangeman sort of Tory background, not particularly wealthy, self-made businessman. His family refused to bury him in a Muslim, unconsecrated, so in a Muslim grounds. So Quilliam had to they had to do the janazah in Anglican grounds. You never would have known that, I don't think, if it hadn't been reported in the Crescent. So some of the other converts actually were not even sure that they stayed in the faith. You know, it's not entirely clear. And then some of the converts were very, very elderly, as was the case with Robert Reschid. So some died in the early years of the community. Some did remain Muslims. Many of them actually moved out of Britain. Some of them went to travel abroad and to live in the Muslim lands. And so we've lost track of them. But because there's something of the order, there are hundreds of people who converted to Islam. If you can imagine, giving you a general answer to this is very difficult, because it's like doing 200 times the version of what Christina has done. If you imagine, so she spent 2 years on one person, how much time would you need to cover 200 people? And so answering the question of what happened to the Liverpool Muslims is actually, you know, it's not that easy to give you the full answer. What we can say is it's a work in progress.
Good. Okay, another question now. I'm sorry, I failed, neglected to take the name of the questioner, so please forgive me, but the questioner will recognize their own question. It's a question about comparisons between the Victorian Muslim community of Liverpool and the existing community, they said of London, but I think they actually mean Woking. Okay. There was, of course, a community in London at the same time, but the bigger community comparatively would have been Woking, around the mosque there. Yahya, would you like to comment on that in terms of comparisons about these two communities?
Well, yeah, I mean, Quillian did have, and the Liverpool Muslims did have connections with Muslims in London, actually, as well, not just Woking. So obviously at the time that Quilliam's community was active and the Liverpool Muslim Institute was active, the Woking Mosque, a purpose-built mosque that opened in 1889, it wasn't functioning as a community mosque. It was a restricted access for students of the Oriental College to which the Working Mosque was attached. G.W. Leitner, who had originally wanted to kind of build, create a college that was multi-faith, so he was going to build a mandir and a gurdwara, but he didn't get that far in his plans. He'd started with the mosque, but he wasn't able to build other religious buildings. So it was part of his sort of ecumenical kind of religious view that he built it this way. So actually the relationships with Muslims in London was actually quite important to Liverpool Muslims. So for instance, people like Rafi-ad-Din Ahmed, for instance, who was a big part of the Anjuman-e-Islam, the Islamic society in London. He was one of the first vice presidents of the Liverpool Muslim Institute. So they had connections with the Indian students and activists who were in London running the Anjuman. And regularly, sometimes for important meetings, Quillian would either go himself or would send down one of his sons, like Bilal, who would send them down to these meetings in London. And also from 1895, there was a mosque, a temporary mosque that was established near Euston. And that was by Muhammad Ali Dolly, if I got the name right. He said his son had been educated at the Liverpool Muslim Institute. So there were connections, and of course Nafisa Keep, after she left Liverpool, she was exiled from the community by Quillian. She eventually wound up in the London Temporary Mosque with Dolly as well for a time, and so there was interchange between these two communities in London and Liverpool.
Especially at the later end of Quilliam's life, when he returned almost incognito from Turkey and took up an assumed name and was quite active in the Woking Mosque. So that suggests that the links would have been there to facilitate Quilliam's kind of re-entry onto the British Muslim scene and be facilitated quite cordially at the Woking Mosque, rather than heading back to Liverpool.
No, I agree. But the thing is, I suspect it wasn't. I suspect it was an open secret. I suspect that the Muslim community knew that Professor Leon was of Sheikh Abdullah Quillian and knew that all along. It was just for wider society that they attempted to. They respected that, if you like, that open secret, or tried to keep it more becoming, public, stop it from becoming public knowledge. But I think they were all aware of who he was. Yeah,
and I think the networks that may have and did exist. This is an area that's coming to light as more research is being done on the subject. We have a question from Lucinda Matthews, and this is directly to you, Chris, and it's about Robert Reschid Stanley's wife. Lucinda's interested to know, do we know what happened to Robert Reschid's wife? Did she convert to Islam? Do you have any details about what her story was, her background, etc.?
From relatives, one of my oldest relatives who, knows Emma Meredith was her name. She became Emma Stanley, and they were together a long time, Robert and Emma, and they celebrated their golden wedding anniversary at Bellevue in Manchester, which was a very posh place to have your golden anniversary for your tea party. As far as we know, as far as the family have said, she definitely never converted to Islam. We know nothing of her, and it was a source of constant frustration because she very much kept in the shadows by the sound of things, looking through the local newspapers. The only mention I ever could find of her was when she was Lady Mayoress, and she had a stall at the bazaar to raise money so that the factory workers could buy the plot of land that then became Stamford Park in Ashton. But other than that, there's nothing on it. There's not even any photographs. The only photograph I've got, I can quickly share with you here if you're interested, is of some of Robert's children there. that's 5 of his kids. He had 10. Oh, he had 11. Sorry, he had 11 children. So Emma worked in the shop. She ran a shop. She ran a tea shop. She brought up 11 children. She had to put up with being a lady mayoress for 2 years. Whether or not she enjoyed that, I don't know. Personally, I wouldn't have. But yeah, I know nothing about her, which is why I wrote the second book, which is the Imagining Robert book, because I wrote a monologue from her point of view. Really, I suppose, gathering from my own family's experience of when my brother converted, how we felt. We all had different feelings about it. We all had different emotions. We had different reactions from the community, some good, some bad. And I guess I put some of that onto Emma, and I tried to express it through a monologue about how she might have felt in a very different world, but very similar feelings of not quite betrayal, but, you know, something that you've given your family has been taken away, and you've got this, you know, this new loyalty to a new group of people that are unfamiliar. So yeah, it's a shame, and I would love there to have been more documents from the women, working class women in those days, but nothing, unfortunately.
Okay, well, that's an area for continued research. I'm going to try and get in as many questions as possible, so I'll kindly ask both Chris and Yahya to try to condense their answers as much as they can. A question from O. Williams, and that is, are there any plans to collate this existing research into a single work, possibly an exhibition or a compendium or an anthology? Perhaps Yahya, you might be more suited to address this question.
I hope so. I mean, I don't know whether it will be us, but you know, there are a lot of things, organizations like Everyday Muslim that put on traveling exhibitions. They've done some wonderful work down in Woking, and they put together an historic trail. So I do think Liverpool needs a historic Muslim trail like Woking does. And I'm here to help put that together, or any kind of exhibition. I'm here to offer my services pro bono to make that happen. But I completely agree to Umar's question that we need to have, you know, educational outputs for this to work at different levels. But I'll just end quickly. My daughter is doing A-level religious studies at a Bradford school. The teacher brought in and mentioned the Liverpool Muslim community as as an example in one of the lessons. So obviously this research somehow does percolate, you know.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah. Sorry, I was making notes, trying to squeeze these questions in. A question now from Hasib Khan about information that we may have on female Victorian Muslims, other than Lady Evelyn Zainab Kobal. Is there any research? Is there any research that's been undertaken that we know of that kind of focuses on perhaps female members? It does tend to be kind of male orientated to some degree. Yeah, the 12 characters in your forthcoming publication, are any of them females?
Yes. Well, I think that Nafisa Keep deserves, definitely will interest a lot of people if someone can do a decent job on her life, because she goes between America, Britain, Egypt, back to Britain, and then she ends up in Australia. And she has a very interesting later life too, and as a campaigner for women's rights in Australia, which hasn't really been touched on. So I think Nafisa Keep would be a great one to do. And I think Sheikh Hamid Mahmoud needs to write his book about Fatima Cates. He's been working on Fatima. You know, Fatima Cates was the first woman to convert to Islam in Liverpool, or the first to respond to Quilliam's call to Islam. And so there's also Fatima, and I think, and also Sheikh Hamid is pulling up stuff about Hubert Halim, Kate Quillian, who Quillian adopted after Fatima's death, and her son is doing work on him. He fought in the First World War, by the way. So there's work to be done on these stories. Also the Rosa Elliott is another convert to, sorry, Rosa Warren, another convert, Rosa Warren. She played the organ on Sundays in the Liverpool Muslim Institute. So where they had the Sunday service, which was this kind of hybrid kind of service that they had. It was like a high sort of Protestant form, but with sort of Islamic creed. Quillian and his community changed the words. One thing I should say, Sid, is that while we were doing research for this book, we found the sole surviving copy of the hymn book used at the Liverpool Muslim Institute.
Oh, fantastic.
And so we used that to compare against what Asmai was saying. And it's a fascinating document. So yeah, I think that there's more work to be done. Dr. Saria, contractor at the University of Coventry, is also working on Muslim women. I believe that she and Jamie Gillam are bringing out a book as well, possibly on the early Muslim women. So I think work is being done.
Yes, I can confer. I was approached to submit a chapter to that edited edition. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that also. We're basically at the end of our session. I think thankfully we've managed to cover most of the questions. Sorry if I missed one or two of you. It remains for me to thank both of our guest speakers, Christina Longdon and Yahya Birt, for their wonderful presentations and their very detailed question and answer sessions. I'd like to thank Kisra, of course, and the MACFEST for giving us this space so that this research can get out there more to the public. And I think I feel that this is inspiring to see both Christina and to see Yahya and hear them talk about their research. I think it's inspiring for our next generation of scholars to realize that there is a future in perhaps, digging into archives and discovering our British Muslim history. And what it does, importantly, it provides us with a very, very much needed cultural anchorage to this country and to our society. And perhaps there are lessons to learn from it. So I'd like to thank all of our participants as well. We had at one point, I think, more than 95 people were able to get in. I'm sure more were trying. And thank you very much indeed. So Chris, Yahya, I think we're ending right on time. And with that, I say thank you to both of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And to my co-authors.